Excuse me.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you really very much for inviting me. It's really, I'm really quite honoured actually to be invited here to do a talk on this. The title of the talk that Stuart asked me to talk about tonight was what is sovereign money and how do we get there? So I'm going to do about 20 minutes on each, what is sovereign money and how do we get there, and hopefully in the first half that covers a lot of questions about why we should get there as well, because it shows that there's quite a few problems in our system as it is. So what I want you to just think in the back of your minds during the talk is, firstly, remember that money is a construct designed by people or humans to serve us, and if we find ourselves in servitude to it, then that's one really good reason to sort of reassess the design of the system, because it is a man-made design system. And also keep in the back of your head the question, what is the economy for anyway? Because that sort of helps put it all in perspective. So, I'll practice changing my slides. So what I'm going to tell you is, I'm going to tell you that money's created by banks when they lend money. I'm going to tell you that our money system is based on debt, and so we want to have money, we're going to have debt, and that has a whole series of problems for us, and we're going to go through the problems that creates. So that's what I'm going to tell you. And so first I want to just explain how it comes about. So the first thing that happens is banks create a debt, and that's like a credit. They create credit, and I'm going to use the word credit and debt interchangeably. So I want you to think of this as bank money, and if they've got a ledger, and that black line there is basically a 0 point. Okay, so they create a debt, and that happens first. And when that is drawn down, it becomes monetized, and then it looks like this. That money gets deposited in a bank account somewhere. So this here could be an average of all of the banks, but basically the debt and the money, there's the same amount there. So their ledger books are still balancing out, so everything's legal. But it was the debt that came first, and that's the important point. They've got the debt, and secondly, they look for the corresponding deposits. So the debt's created the money, but notice that if we paid back all our debts, all our money would disappear. So that's the first problem with the system. So I'm going to do a few appeals to higher authority during the talk. And this goes from the International Monetary Fund. The key function of banks is money creation, not intermediation. If you tell that to a mainstream economist, it's already provocative, even though it's 100% correct. So this bank money, I'm going to call it, is 98% of all the money in our economy. It's electronic. So here's our little graph again. We've got our debt, we've got our money, but what happens is we have to pay interest on the money. So the interest is down the bottom here. Now, what we can see from this is that now there's more money owing to the bank than there actually is in the economy. So now, if we paid back all our loans, there'd be no money in the economy and we'd still owe money to the bank. And the second thing is, I want to talk about the concept of economic rent, because now, for all of us to spend money, it's costing us as a society. There is a debt attached by a chain and a ball to every single dollar we've got. So even if you haven't got a mortgage on your house and you're debt-free, all the goods and services in our society have that cost of the debt built into them. So effectively we're all paying for this money to be there. It's like renting our money supply off the banks. And so that's a cost. So the other thing I want you to notice from this is we've got to pay that interest, and that interest comes out of the real economy, the productive part of the economy, and it gets paid to deposit holders. Now, the thing about that is that 90% of people are actually net payers of interest, and 10% of people, roughly, are net receivers of interest. So actually, because of the way this works, there's a general flow of wealth from the real economy, from the people that are borrowing money, up into the non-productive part of the economy, and that's called a trickle-up effect. So it is basically we've got a transfer of wealth, and this is a slide I borrowed off Positive Money in the UK, and it basically says the same thing. It's a transfer of income and wealth from the bottom 90% to the top 10% of the population, just from the way this is designed. The other feature of the system is that we need more money always to pay the interest on those loans. But to get that money we need more loans. And so actually the system goes round and round and round and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's a requirement for growth. And when you superimpose that on a finite planet, we realise that it can't go on forever. And so to appeal to a higher authority again, this is Professor Herman Daly, former senior economist at the World Bank. We're accumulating more and more debt to finance economic growth, and we need more future growth to repay that debt. So that's probably quite an important part of the system, but I quite like this quote. Anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever on a finite planet or world is either a madman or an economist. So that sort of puts it in perspective. So, what does this look like? Now, in a nutshell, or a balloon, I've stylised the economy as a balloon. So as you've got an expanding economy with a boom, the balloon's going to get bigger, and as you get a recession, the balloon's going to shrink. And how big that balloon is or how small it is at any time is really important to how our livelihoods are going, really. But the only way the air can get in that balloon, or the money, is from the banks. So the bank's money lent goes in, bank loans are repaid, it comes out. We're entirely dependent on that. So, if we have a look at the economy within the balloon. Now, a lot of that is the non-productive economy, but the real part of the economy is a small part of that balloon. So, what we see here is that the government can take some money out as tax and re-spend it as expenditure into our society, into the economy, and that gives them a surplus or a deficit, but they're only using money that's already there, and if they borrow it, it has to come from the banks through the bottom of the balloon as well, remember. The only way the money can get there is through the banks. So the government's continually taxing and spending and trying to balance those books within the size of the balloon it's got very little control over. And over on the left here, I've just put our current account as well with our balance of payments. So what you want to see here is that when a bank notices the economy's doing well, it's really confident. So the bank's likely to give more loans, and the balloon's likely to get bigger, and the bank thinks things are going well, and the balloon's likely to get bigger. And then if there's a recession, the bank is really scared and doesn't want to give loans, and then it gets smaller and smaller. This is called being a pro-cyclical way of money. The banks don't want to lend when money's needed there, but when we're doing really well, the banks are really, really happy to lend. So we've got all this money being inflated. So another key part of the system is a pro-cyclical money system rather than a self-balancing monetary system. So turn again once to Positive Money. They've come up with this wonderful cartoon, and it really summarises it well. You've got the politicians, and they're saying, well, the economy needs more money, and we think we should go into more debt to get the more money into the economy that we need. And the other viewpoint is, we don't want to get into debt, so we need to have less money. So what Positive Money is saying is, or sovereign money proponents are saying, we actually can have less debt and have more money when we need it as well. And that's exactly what we're proposing. So I found a nice little cartoon in the paper, so I thought I'd put that in as well. And it just goes to show that when they need the money the most, that's often when they want to cut the budget, and so you're expecting the economy to run on a really thin margin. So let's look at some figures. What does this look like if we're going to look at New Zealand economy in terms of this bank money that we're using? So here we have a nice graph here. Now, the left-hand margin is, actually you can't really read the figures, but it's in billions of dollars, and it goes right up to 450 at the top, yep. And we've got years at the bottom here, all the way from 1978 right down up to 2017. So what I want you to take from this is that the yellow line is domestic credit, so that includes private debt and public debt. And notice how fast it's going up, and notice that it's way bigger than the red line, which is our money supply. And it's always bigger than our money supply. And if we used all our money to pay back that debt, there wouldn't be enough because we owe more than the money we've got in the entire economy. So that's what I want you to take from that. So that's how the money system works at the moment. This is another appeal to a higher authority. Mervyn King, former Governor of the Bank of England, Chairman of its Monetary Policy Committee. Of all the ways of organising banking, the worst is the one we have today. I mean, you can see why they're saying these things. And here's another one. Martin Wolf was the chief commentator at the Financial Times, which is quite a prestigious magazine. Subcontracting the job of creating money to private profit-seeking business is not the only possible monetary system. It may not even be the best one. Indeed, there's a case for letting the state create money directly. So that's what positive money is. So I told you I was going to tell you that money's created by banks when they lend, and if we want more money, we've got to have more debt, and how it results in a series of problems for people and planet. And I've been through some of the problems with you, the economic rent, the trickle-up effect causing inequality, the growth requirement, and the pro-cyclical nature of how money works. So it's not working particularly well. So keep in the back of your head, what's the economy for? It's to work well for us. So enter sovereign money. A sovereign money system changes money back to the way most people think it works now. Now, actually, most people think that the Reserve Bank or our government is actually in charge of our money supply. Who would have thought it had been subcontracted out to private profit-seeking businesses? Studies have shown most people don't realise this. So I want people to think of it as we're just changing it back to the way most people think it works. And that is the state would issue all of the monetary requirements we have, and banks would be needed, and they would be genuine, true intermediaries. They would lend out money they've got, and they'd be a middleman. So what does the sovereign money ledger look like? Okay, well, first we have money. Okay, it's introduced by the government to our requirements. And notice that the productive part of the economy is much bigger when we introduce it straight into the real economy. And then what happens is some people want a mortgage, some people want to start a business, and they need a debt. So the people who have excess money decide they're going to lend it out and via the bank. And so there is some debt, but it's much less debt because we don't require that much debt to have the economy running and ticking over. It's just not a requirement of the system to have that much debt. So what happens is there's less debt in the system. What we notice is there's also, therefore, less interest paid, and so there's less trickle up, there's less requirement for growth, and also what I forgot to say the first time we looked at this is also the banks are obviously taking their portion of profit but the big four banks in New Zealand are taking it at the moment off overseas because that's where they're owned. So that was $3.5 billion last year. Now, banks need to make a profit. They're businesses. But if they're genuine intermediaries offering us a service, and this is how it looks, that actually would be significantly less. It would be a little slither at the bottom there. So that would be how a sovereign money ledger looks. Now, how does the balloon look? Notice it's a plug at the bottom. So the banks aren't responsible for introducing money into our economy. And what happens is the government does, but it doesn't tax first. It introduces money, it measures how the economy's going, and in order to balance the inflation of that balloon, it can still tax money out. But what we have now is a much stronger mechanism for control over what's going on in the real economy. We can have money when we need it without debt, and also we're not going to get a pro-cyclical nature where, because the government can not spend so much when things are going too well, and it can spend money in if we're looking like we've got a recession. So it counters that nicely. So has all this been looked at? Has it been studied? Has anyone done any analysis to see whether this would be worth adopting? Well, funnily enough, yes, they have. There was only one, but it was a big study at the International Monetary Fund done in 2012. And the paper is over here if you want to have a look at the end. I believe Don's provided some of those papers. So this is a photo of my copy of it at home. And I'll go over what the abstract says. So they modelled it. They modelled doing exactly this. And what did they find? They found much better control of the major source of business cycle fluctuations. So what they're saying is it's not pro-cyclical. We can have money when we need it without the debt, and vice versa. And we're not going to get banks inflating a balloon that's already inflated, and vice versa. The second thing they said is that we get a complete elimination of bank runs. Now that's something I haven't covered with you. So in the bank money system we've got at the moment, we've got money and we've got debt. If everybody went to withdraw their money, they cannot give it to you because they just simply haven't got it because they've got the debt there. What banks normally do is keep a little bit of money on the side. It's their liquidity. And so if you go and withdraw some money, they're able to give you something, and that's what they give to you. So if too many people think the bank's not stable and get worried and they all go and withdraw their money, that's a bank run, and the bank can't give it to you, and it just shuts the door. So with this system we get a complete elimination of those bank runs. And I also just at this point want to talk a little bit about the Open Bank Resolution Act the government's put through. So that says if there's a really bad recession and everybody's defaulting on their loan, well, what we're going to have is a collapse of the bank, and our complete payment system in our economies is going to malfunction because the bank has to shut. So because we rely on the banks so heavily for our payment systems, the banks are too big to fail. So therefore we need a way to keep them afloat. And there's two different ways to do that. The first is that the government bails them out, and that's effectively paid for by the taxpayer. And the second way is what our government's done is Open Bank Resolution Act, which says that everybody that's got money in the bank gets some taken off them, so it now belongs to the bank. So you get a trimmed amount off your balance in the bank. And these are the sort of headlines you see here. And I'm going to put that as another positive for sovereign money, is the banks are no longer too big to fail. That's one of the headlines just the other day actually, so I thought I'd stick that one in there. So what's Bernie Sanders got to say about that? If the environment were a bank, it would have been saved already. So banks have got a lot of power. They're basically socialising the risks and capitalising their profit because we're guaranteeing them for the business that they run. So back to our abstract from this study they did. Guess what they found? They found a reduction in net public debt. Well, the government actually wouldn't need to borrow any money at all, so that debt would definitely be reduced. A reduction in private debt, we saw that as well when we went through it. And our output gains approach 10% and steady state inflation can drop to zero. So output is the amount of goods that's being produced. But did you notice, the productive economy is a lot healthier. So output does increase, which means that what happens then is that when the government puts more money into the economy, if you've got a matched output, you're not going to get the inflation with it. So I need to touch on inflation with you. And if anyone's familiar with the work of Keynes, he said creating money by the government cannot be inflationary if it's matched by increased output. So how do we implement this? We cannot let the government just run too wild and just print whatever they want, obviously. So what Positive Money propose is to put that in a different entity within the Reserve Bank called the Monetary Policy Committee. And independent from the government, transparent and accountable. And what they do is they have a look at all the social indicators available to them and figure out exactly how much money could be introduced to an economy without causing runaway inflation and what's a sensible amount. And then the government of the day, who's elected, will be able to choose how that goes into the economy. So that's the safeguard there against it as well, so we don't get Zimbabwe-style runaway inflation. So they would be tasked with deciding how much of the economy's money supply needs to be issued or not to stay within inflationary limits and other parameters within its mandate. So I want you to notice that it's a bit difficult to read, but for example, last year nearly $20 billion in new money into the economy, and we didn't get a hyperinflationary crisis. Even in the recession in 2009, we still had more money entering the economy. That was only $2.5 billion, but more money is entering all the time. So just bear that in mind in the magnitude of it, because we're not seeing inflation with what we've got here. So in a sovereign system, we talked about how it changes the money back to the way most people think it works now. We talked about how the state will issue all of its money requirements and the banks would operate as true intermediaries. So the next part of the talk is how we're going to get there. And I put this quote in here from the well-known Economist magazine, who ran an article on this. And they said it's not capitalism, it's creditism. And it is a system which is broken down, and unless you understand it, you will not be able to fix it. So the thing is, not many people understand it. Hopefully tonight you guys can understand it better. But we have to know what we're dealing with before we go ahead and try and change it. And that's one of the things, and that involves us and that involves you. Once we get it, we need to go and tell people and point them to places like Positive Money and say we need to be looking at this. So we've got to understand it to be able to fix it. Okay, now the result we want to see is a sovereign money policy. One of the first things we can do is take individual actions. Big or small, they all count. And whether it's just something on social media or whether it's writing a letter. And I use the example here where I wrote a letter to Bill English about this. I decided that I'd see what he had to say on the matter, and he said, the government believes the official cash rate is the most effective tool for influencing the demand for credit and hence the money supply. So what I said to him, which was very much a lot of the material in this talk, fell on deaf ears with him, and he just basically wrote back and said, it's working fine, it's working fine. But I think all these actions count, and they're all valid. Then we've got educational organisations, and in New Zealand we're very lucky to have Positive Money, and what they do is provide a lot of information about how the system works or isn't working for us, what we can do about it. And they not only exist here, but these organisations actually are all over the world. So they're all a member of the International Movement for Monetary Reform, and just about every country now has got a group of people recognising it's not working for us, we need to do something different, and they're trying to get enough people involved so that the people that have got the power to make change can hear the question, why don't we have a monetary system that works for people and planet? The purple one there is Positive Money in the UK, and they were I think they were the first group that came into being, and if you want more information, their website's just amazing. But they're all over the world now, and it's a growing movement. So, any political party that dares to say they want to have a sovereign money system, heaven forbid, needs support. And it is not an easy thing to do, and I went through every registered political party that's on the elections website just to be sure who is advocating this. And none of them are, except for, bless them, Democrats for Social Credit, who have been saying the same thing for a long time, and unfortunately still falling on deaf ears. So they have got the positive money message in there, and they need to be given credit for that. Excuse the pun. But there's no other political parties that are actually over the 5% threshold in New Zealand at all, but there is overseas. Okay, just so you know, the Green Party in the UK have got this policy. They talk about it well, and they advocate it. And the Green Party in the United States of America, Jill Steen's done an amazing job. If you watch some of her interviews of talking to this, she's just so engaged and well articulated the way she describes it. It's really worth watching some of her interviews. But again, getting the traction on that has been really difficult for them. But they're there. And so I encourage whatever political persuasion you are to go to your particular political party and say, there are really good reasons we need to look at this. So that's the next one. Change the policy of existing political parties. So this was the route that I took, and that's one of the reasons I think Stuart invited me here, was my very now infamous remit that I put into New Zealand First. So I was a member of the party, and I was going as a delegate to their conference, and I thought, right, I'll put in a remit about this. And what that involved was writing it up, and it was a whole paragraph, but in essence, I'll show you. This is a picture of me here my husband took with the iPhone at the back of the conference, explaining to the delegates why we should do this. A lot of them had never heard it, but I basically said the Reserve Bank should be solely responsible for issuing New Zealand's money supply. It was a much more succinct version than tonight, but I brandished that International Monetary Fund paper, and it passed. I got 90 people vote in favour and 50 against. So that's really quite an achievement, even though it has not seen the light of day since. None of the MPs want to touch it. In fact, every single MP voted against it, but just goes to show you what their supporter base thought. So that was really encouraging for a while. Yeah, so I've just got to tell you, I'm not a representative of New Zealand First, and it was never made official policy. I've got to be really clear about that. But it's certainly got quite a bit of attention in certain circles for a while. So that was an action people can take. Somebody could take that to the Greens if they want, or wherever. Okay, another thing we can do is force political change. I just want to point out that this is happening in Switzerland. They've got an amazing democracy there, and they've got a system where if the citizens want something enough, they can have a binding citizens-initiated referendum. And I think that that's a really great way to run a democracy, because, you know, you're taking the heat off the politicians who don't want to be sort of put on the spot about this radical new idea. The people take control of that, and in a way they're putting themselves over the top of the politicians in terms of power. So they managed to get their 100,000 signatures to say, actually, we do want to have this referendum, and that will go to the vote this year on the 10th of June. This is actually really big, because if that goes through, it's binding, and the Swiss government has to go through with that. It'll be the first country who's gone back to a proper sovereign system. So they will be asked, who should be allowed to create new Swiss francs, private commercial banks, or the Swiss National Bank, which is obliged to act in the interest of Switzerland as a whole, knew which one I would vote for. But you do have a lot of vested interests, you know, putting their 2 cents worth into their argument, so it is quite an argument over there. Okay, now the next one I honestly think is the most important out of this whole talk. If you take nothing out of it, we need to start with the government's debt, with our domestic credit, with our government debt, because I think it's a huge ask for the government to suddenly change the entire money system. Yes, I'd like to see it done, but I've tried, and I've decided, and this is not positive money policy, I think we need to start with just Reserve Bank credit. So that's the money that the government lends from overseas. That needs to come from our own Reserve Bank, not the overseas private banks. So we're doing the same thing we're doing now, but we're just doing it with our own bank. So this is the first part in a long process, but it gets people realising we can issue our own money. Now, I am talking about a debt with the Reserve Bank, the government's debt to the Reserve Bank. However, that is a debt to an agency that belongs to the country, to itself, and it is also a debt where they pay no or low interest, and the interest they do pay goes back to themselves. So just in effect, it is an actual sovereign money system. So these are our options. The government wants a debt, it needs money. We can continue to borrow from privately owned overseas banks who are wholly owned overseas, who lend at higher interest rates, and the interest goes straight offshore, or we can bring that back internally and say the Reserve Bank will take over that function, thank you very much. It really is not rocket science. So it's wholly owned by the government, they could lend at low interest, and the extra revenue is paid to the Crown accounts, and that's what's written on their website anyway. So this is the first step in the process, because I think it's a lot less threatening. All we're saying is let's do it with our bank, not the overseas private banks. And this is what it would look like. The Reserve Bank would take on the same role the private banks do now. The government will borrow from its own Reserve Bank in the best interests of New Zealand citizens. Now, at the moment, we've got, I think the government debt's about $60 billion. We're paying about $10 million interest a day. So you imagine if that was either going back to ourselves instead of going offshore. So if we superimpose that onto a balloon, this is my halfway balloon. So the bottom, the banks are still busy creating money as debt, but the government can actually control the real economy itself through the Reserve Bank. So they can spend into our real economy as we need, and they're obviously taxing out just to control the size of that. This is what it would look like. So that sounds like common sense. Guess what? It's actually been done before. The first Labour government did exactly this in 1936. And, you know, note it's Labour, so they've done it. It's like they've set a precedent for themselves as far as I'm concerned, and I think they should be doing it again. And so Labour had just been voted in, and they borrowed money from the Reserve Bank, and they built a load of state houses. Now, what happened was the money went into the real economy. I think they only put in about 5% of the GDP at the time, and the GDP went up 30%, just what we needed in the middle of a recession. New Zealand came out of that recession faster than any other country in the OECD, and they got themselves an income-earning asset. It just worked brilliantly. There was no hyperinflation because the economy had the capacity to take that extra money. They had a place to put the output. So that's exactly an example of why that could work well now. We need to remind Labour of this. So I just want to talk about inflation again. This was a question and answer that I copied from a live interview with Bill English during the 2014 election. because somebody said to him, well look Bill English, you know, we've got $60 billion debt now, and it was 10 billion. 10 billion to 60 billion over that 6 years, that's a lot of money. So what they're saying is we had $50 billion come into the economy over that 6 years. You know, what's happened and what are we going to do with it? Notice we didn't get hyperinflation. And his response was here, and I've just put in and read the important bits, well, 15 billion went into funding Christchurch. Youthquake Fund also put a lot into that as well. And we borrowed money to continue to support families in the economy. So what he's saying is they put $50 billion into the real economy, but we didn't get a hyperinflationary crisis. We just got what we got over those 6 years. So there's absolutely, again, no reason why that money had to be borrowed offshore. It could have been borrowed from our Reserve Bank. And these are the sort of headlines we're seeing now. I just plucked a few out, you know. Where's the money going to come from? You know, there's no money available for child poverty reduction. We're investigating innovative ways to bridge funding gaps. And now they've got this regional development fund, which is brilliant. But it's exactly the sort of thing that doesn't require further debt for the country. It will increase output so that capacity is there, it can be absorbed, and we're not going to see a hyperinflationary crisis from that. So support MPs is the next thing. If any MP is going to talk about ever using Reserve Bank credit, they need our support, because this is huge and they get poo-pooed for it really easily and people don't understand it, and all sorts of rhetoric starts coming out like helicopter money, and people suddenly go into a fear of a Zimbabwe type situation, and it's people like us that need to take the step up and support that MP and say, actually, these are all the reasons it's a really sensible idea. We're doing it anyway, we're just doing it with overseas banks and we're replacing it with our own bank. I mean, it's common sense. So they need our support if it's ever done again, because it was done once by Russell Norman in 2012. He mooted using our own Reserve Bank credit, and it did not go down well. And unfortunately in 2012 I didn't even know how money came into existence, or I would have been making a huge song and dance to support him. But he suggested that we put $2 billion into the economy for Christchurch. $2 billion. Okay, our government debt at the moment is 60. Remember, we've got $20 billion coming into the entire economy every year. $2 billion. There's a tiny portion of that. And he was suggesting rather than borrow it from overseas banks, we borrow it from our own bank. So what happened? Oh, Stephen Joyce said, oh, our friends would say you're losing the plot. So, oh, what would everybody else say? What would everybody else think is one objection. The government said, this is all written in this article, the government said, oh, it would lift the cost of living. So what they're saying is $2 billion is going to cause inflation. And John Key said the idea is wacky, it's like Zimbabwe, despite the fact that in this article he's talking about a Reserve Bank oversight. This is the response they're getting, okay? It's a huge thing for these MPs to try and moot this, but yet it is so important, and it's us that has to support them, not only to put this in place, but to make people educated, and if they say it, to go and defend them, because they need us, because Russell Norman backed down. He backed down and he retracted it and he forgot about it, because he couldn't deal with the onslaught of the opposition and the media. And I think also they maybe could have been a little bit more strategic or organised in the way they mooted this. I think in future, if it ever done, they need to have all their arguments in place, all their MPs educated, and even another coalition partner in understanding what's happening. And with a huge supporter base, it could be done. I think that we could get there. Look, I once spoke to an MP, and who shall remain nameless, about this. I got them aside and I said, look, this is why we should do it. And you know what they said to me? They said, Amanda, what would the media say? Mm-hmm. So this is it. The media is incredibly powerful, and it's the people that need to go back and write the letters, and they need us. They need us if they're going to do it, because that's the response they're going to get. So good on Russell Norman. Okay, the last one is other, and I just wanted to tell you all about something that went on in Canada. A committee on monetary and economic reform in Canada, bless them, took the government to court for not using their own central bank. It went as high as the Supreme Court, but eventually got turned down because the Supreme Court said that the government was in no obligation to do what was in the best interests of its citizens. That is true, and it's all written here. But bless them for taking the action. They actually said a lot positive came out of that, because the awareness grew and people understood what they were doing and why, and saw the common sense of it. So there's all our methods. So how do we get there? We need you. Anything you can do at all is really important. Any of those things I've talked about in any capacity you've got is the way there, because to make the political change happen, it has to be from the ground up. And when that happens, we will get our sovereign money, and here we have a lovely screenshot of a future headline we're going to have one day in the future. And it says, it's from the Herald, and it says, the main parties agree to follow the first Labour government's use of interest-free Reserve Bank credit. And then we'll have our sovereign money. And that's the end of the story, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks.